Hello and welcome, or welcome back. We've heard about the Bundestrojaner remote forensic software in the previous talk, and we will now learn how terrorists use the internet. This talk will be rather shortly. It is about half of an hour, and it will then there will be a quarter of an hour of discussion because Marco has to leave early. So have fun.
Yeah, I have a second topic for you, how terrorists use the internet, cyber terrorism. When you're reading current legislation in the area of cybercrime, new instruments, new provisions to criminalize certain activities, you always find references that are linking this legislation to terrorism. So when you're reading them, and I'm reading them on a regular level, on a regular basis, you know there is a lot of terrorism going on in the internet. It must be an incredible number, so dangerous. So everything is so terrible what there is going on with regard to terrorism. I would like to give you an idea what is the basis where we can really discuss on. What are information that we really have about terrorism on the internet. And there are two difficulties I would like to point out. In the beginning, currently the term terrorism is used as a justification for stricter laws. This is especially happening in the period after the attacks in New York in 2001. For some period of time, let's say, well, at least 4 or 5 years, it was sufficient to mention the word terrorism to stop any kind of refusing legislation. Any politician who would stand up and say, listen, this might not be a good law, what is the justification? They would always say, listen, it's a fight against terrorism. Do you really want to support terrorism by refusing this legislation? That was for a period of time after the shock of the attacks, completely sufficient. Terrorism anywhere, and you wouldn't need a justification. But terrorism is a word that is describing a phenomenon. It is neither a justification nor an explanation. It's just a term. It is describing a phenomenon. So in addition, if we need stricter laws, and I'm going to speak about the legal issue as well, if we need stricter laws, we have to explain why is that. And just mentioning its fight against terrorism is definitely not sufficient. And the difficulty is, I would point out one example, and I've mentioned this in the previous discussion. It is very closely connected to the question of data retention. In Italy, there is a law. It's one of the laws that was implemented with regard to the fight against terrorism that forces anybody who would like to offer internet services to the public, and that's not only the access provider, that's somebody who wants to run an internet cafe as well. It forces them to register first of all. They need to go through a registration process, and they need the authorization from a certain agency to be allowed to run the service. And then next step, they need to ask anybody who wants to use their services, a tourist from the United States who would like to drop into an internet cafe to check his email, they have to ask him for his identification and write down the identification to ensure that if this is a terrorist, they can trace back the route and they know who was acting. Because if you're using public internet services, well, you never know who was using them. So this is a law that was justified with a fight against terrorism. I don't know how many terrorists are based in Italy. I haven't heard about so many. I don't know how many terrorists are spending their holiday there just to check their emails, but this is a measure which is very difficult to explain. It's a very critical measure. It's a very difficult law. It was simply explained with the need to fight against terrorism. And the difficulty that I see is within this legislation there are no sufficient numbers mentioned. Nobody tells us how many terrorists do we have in the internet. There are just very few information that you can collect. Because what is happening, and as I'm working for international organizations, I'm running into senior lawmakers from time to time, and when you're speaking to them about terrorism, they always say, well, you know, there are cases, but I will never be able to tell you when they happened, how many of them. I can just tell you there are cases. So states are very much afraid of offering information about this because this could this could lead to difficulties. People could lose the trust in the government if they get the impression they are not able to fight against those attacks because they're happening on a regular basis. So we might not even know that terrorists are attacking critical infrastructure every day 20 times because nobody's telling us. And if nobody's reporting this, we're having a problem. So the FBI, for example, said with regard to cybercrime, please report them. If you don't report them, we don't know how big the problem is. So the same with regard to cyber terrorism. We have very few information. So from my point of view, if we want to have a scientific discussion, and I'm a scientist, we need a basis for that. We need sufficient information, and we cannot just say I have heard that somebody said that there was a report published once that says that there are terrorists on the internet. So that's definitely not sufficient. There is another problem when we're talking about terrorism, and that's the definition of terrorism. There are quite different national approaches in what is a terrorist. So I'm quite sure some of those people that are defined or categorized as terrorists in some countries wouldn't be terrorists from my point of view. There are a number of approaches to have an international standards in this matter. I have just pointed out one, and I would just like to, this is a much longer definition and contains many more cases, but a terrorist under this definition is somebody who aims to seriously destabilize or destroy the fundamental political structure of a country. And how does he do it? For example, by attacks upon a person's life. So, as we're in Germany, there is one of the great heroes that we do have, von Stauffenberg, who tried to attack Hitler, the former Chancellor of Germany, with a bomb to stop him from continuing his leading role in the Second World War. Well, if we take it serious, the terrorist definition, well, he definitely aims to seriously destroy fundamental political structure. I can tell you, if Hitler would have been dead and removed, there would have been a great chance that the entire regime would break down by attacking a person's life. True, that's what he did. And he did it for political reasons. So if we have a more narrow definition and say it must be political reasons, again, von Stauffenberg would have been a terrorist. But he's not a terrorist. It's a question of the point of view. For the Nazi regime, he was a terrorist. For us today, he's not a terrorist, he is a hero. So I think this is a good example to point out how flexible the definition is and how difficult it is to categorize it right. So when we're talking about terrorism and the fight against terrorism, we always think about, well, the people that are coming from the Arabic countries. But actually, take Northern Ireland. 50% of the society was supporting, in one or the other way, terrorist organizations, terrorist groups there. We have same phenomenon in Spain. Terrorist group active there as well. We had them in Germany. So it's not only the Arabic countries, there are many other countries, and the idea who is a terrorist are completely different. When we're talking about Chechnya, well, the Russians say these are terrorists. When we're talking about Guantanamo, the US says these are terrorists. So it's very difficult just, to come together and have one definition of terrorism. So when we're talking about cyber terrorism, well, I might have a completely different understanding than people in some other place in the world. And as I mentioned before, very difficult. There are just very few information published about those kind of attacks. So when I will try, or in my approach to try to explain to you how big or small the problem is, it is very difficult to refer to sufficient numbers. In the past, especially in the 80s and 90s, the discussion about terrorist attacks were very much concentrating on some ideas how terrorists could attack critical infrastructure. Well, they could hack into a nuclear power plant, and they could run down the power plant, or maybe explode, or whatever. They could run down the entire electricity supply of part of a state, or the entire state. So, of course, after the crash of the electricity system in the United States, there were rumors that said these were hackers who hacked into the system and simply made it run down. But, possible targets were electricity supply, traffic control, emergency in general. So there was a lot of discussion going on in this area, and they said, this is what the terrorists would do. They would attack us. They would attack our infrastructure by using computer technology. And there is a good reason for this discussion, because our information technology is vulnerable. As we can see when we see how many successful virus attacks there are, we can see, yeah, it is possible to attack computer systems, critical infrastructure. When you think about Zasser, the worm designed by a student living not far away from here, well, he proved that it is possible to stop major airlines from operating their flights because the check-in doesn't work anymore. So saying, no, it's not possible, is not true. It is possible. So we can think about a lot of scenarios where they could attack our critical infrastructure. But we have to say these cases are rare. I mean, I cannot even give you any sufficient information about cases that happened. I mean, maybe you have some information. I would be more than happy to hear that. Because people say, yes, there are those cases, but we cannot speak about them. But the fact that this discussion was so long concentrating on this aspect was very much taking away the focus from other aspects, other areas where these terrorists are already working in. And I've tried to put together a few of those areas where terrorists are using the internet and where they are really making use of it in a very powerful way. And I would just like to get through this. Just giving you some background information, there was an Al-Qaeda training manual that was found in Manchester. And the translation says something like, using public sources openly and without resorting to illegal means no circumventing of protection measures. It is possible to gather at least 80% of all information required about an enemy. This is especially referred to the internet. I can find so many information there, so the terrorists are aware of the fact that the internet is a very powerful tool. Well, I'm going to make this rather short. We could have a long philosophical discussion about close links between the structure of the internet and the structure of terrorist organizations. One of the points we can point out there is both are following a decentralized concept. The internet is based on a decentralized architecture. The terrorist organizations, the successful terrorist organizations that we have today, are based on the same structure. So you can hardly control the internet. It is very difficult to control terrorist organizations, even from the inside. But even if, for example, you try to get a terrorist organization out of the country, like we did in Afghanistan, they can rebuild their structure in a very quick way somewhere at a different location. So when